It's officially licensed fun for the whole family, and that's why we give it a score of 8.8 out of 10. Tuck in, kids. IGN is a game-sing journalism publication that strives to review every game set in existence. Although the paper is very popular, there are some impressions of bias, with literally every single excavated game set getting an excoriatingly bad review, in contrast to the universally high praise it doles out to every single game set that ever gets produced by the rapacious game set developer LGN. IGN has been accused of having some kind of deal going with LGN, taking their money in exchange for giving their games overly positive reviews, while giving negative reviews to all non-LGN games. This seems to be supported by the fact that every issue of IGN is filled with advertisements for LGN, covering approximately 90% of every page except of course the front page, on which they cover 100%, and the back cover, on which they cover 135%. Nobody knows what the names IGN and LGN actually stand for, or indeed who any of the people behind them even are, but some have noted a similar soundingness between the two names. Both organizations deny that there's any connection. Sir Topham Fat is a passionate supporter of trainee-on rights, who has worked hard to get into a position of power in the world of trains so he can protect the often abused trainee-ons from corporate interests. They're generally expected to do extremely tiring and thankless work on the pretext that they're just trains, and humans in particular tend to have very little compassion for them, although captaincy priests and priestesses tend to be very fond of them. The Bestia Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, are a very well-respected wireless broadcast service, being one of the first organizations to take advantage of wireless transmission technology to broadcast sound programs to the general public about 12 years ago. One of their earliest success stories was The Barchers, a slice-of-life comedy soap opera that's always been very popular even after the rapid deterioration in quality that began in its third week and has continued to worsen to this day. Unfortunately, being a state-run organization in the relatively cash-strapped nation of Bestia, their broadcasts tend to be made on a shoestring budget. Quite literally in some cases, the top prize for their most glamorous game show is a brand new set of shoelaces, and their production values are eclipsed by literally every other professional broadcast service in the world. Despite this, the BBC continues to enjoy an inexplicable success and popularity that many see as completely inconsistent with the inferior quality of everything they ever produce. Due to Bestia's poor economy and the consequent lack of government funding, the BBC had to turn to other avenues to fund their organization from early on. One of these came about following their successful lobbying of the government to impose a yearly subscription fee for all wireless owners, which has been popularly labeled the BBC tax. This was seen as reasonable in the early days when the BBC provided the only broadcast frequency accessible in Bestia. However, in modern times, many people find it absurd that in a world where Bestia wirelesses can tune into any of literally thousands of different frequencies, all citizens still have to pay the same yearly fee purely because they could technically tune into the one and only BBC frequency at any time if they wanted to for some godforsaken reason. The BBC have responded to complaints on this point that all citizens are welcome to opt out their wireless having access to this BBC frequency by requesting and filling out each of the 7 separate opt-out forms via mail correspondence with an administrator that one simply has to arrange and attend a personal appointment with their local elected politician to receive the contact details once for each of the 7 forms. In response to the rapidly spreading issue of people hiding their wirelesses and not paying the subscription fee, the BBC proceeded to launch a bizarre campaign in which they arranged for horse-drawn carriages to drive around residential areas with a large, spinning wireless receiver dish on the top of them. The BBC maintained that these carriages were traveling around to detect all unpaid wirelesses in the area, and that anyone who hadn't paid the fee would be detected and arrested until investigators discovered that the BBC were lying through their teeth and the receiver dishes were actually made of plasticine and didn't do anything at all. Concerningly, the BBC has a history of lying through their teeth with their messaging. One of the most notorious instances of this was when Bestia was swept with a wave of mass hysteria, with the public believing that Emperor Demarek had found a way to breach the Great Walls of Bestia with a brand new magical sound weapon that they feared would make its way through the gates at any moment. The fears reached a fever pitch to the point that the Liberative government, who were the ruling party at the time, under then-President Boral Simpson Sr., imposed a mandate for all citizens to stay at home and avoid all social contact for several weeks, which was known as the Great Bestia Lockup. The BBC proceeded to broadcast official government advice that citizens could protect their homes from the sound weapon by boarding up all their windows with planks of wood and building a small wooden shelter in their living room, among other things. This advice was issued for some time until Bestia Times journalists determined that the advice was in fact completely useless and had been produced by the Liberative government as part of a deliberate disinformation campaign orchestrated to try and stop the public from complaining about the Liberatives' belligerent war drum banging against Darwich, which is popularly believed to have been responsible for whipping up the climate of fear and paranoia that made the public so susceptible to the groundless sound weapon fears in the first place. The Liberatives still deny that their advice was deliberate disinformation to this day, in spite of the fact that it was, and they give the compelling argument that feelings don't care about your facts. It's strongly suspected that the BBC broadcast this advice to the nation in full knowledge of its complete and utter worthlessness, which is seen to be responsible for the general public distrust of the BBC's self-proclaimed neutrality that continues to this day. Aging transsexual pop idol Eldar the Unflappable desperately tries to stay relevant with the headline song of their new comeback tour. Grace sticks cotton wool in her ears. Eldar connects the captain with the Mower show, which is remarkable because it's something very few people do. In fact, the lack of a captain-related basis for the Mower show has made it very controversial in some circles, especially among intellectuals, and led to movements like the Unmowed, who deride it as fraudulent superstition, and even see it as being responsible for a spread of irrationality and uncritical thinking that may cause modern civilization to collapse unless it is confronted. Such people have always kept quiet because of the intense stigma against these sentiments, and the captaincy's staunch disapproval of them, but an increasingly vocal and militant minority have been making their presence known in recent years. Such movements are now exhibiting signs of an increasing sense of urgency and hostility, referring to wider society as overflowing with unreasonables, suggesting that extreme measures need to be taken to find an ultimate solution to this problem on rational balance so as to bring people's views more in line with the manifest. Ironically, although the intellectual community is the most vocally opposed to this sort of thinking, most of its proponents, and especially its well-known figureheads, are intellectuals themselves, such as Professor Doc Bleatlam, an outspoken advocate of what he calls unteaching, unrational segregation, and who notoriously claimed that parents bringing up a child to believe in the Mower show will do their child more harm than parents raising a she-wolf cub on the high street, an assertion he stands by without apology to this day in spite of the vehement disapproval of literally all grown she-wolfians. Some commentators have noted a profound irony in Bleatlam's failure to provide any sort of scientific evidence for his blatantly spurious and curiously venomous comparison, leading them to wonder if his views and actions are motivated by something other than the impartial concern for rational integrity that he claims them to be. Some of those commentators also wonder if this can be said of the rest of his movement, which is generally insistent that his statement was meant to be interpreted in a specific context-sensitive way that would seem non-obvious and obtuse to the point of being outright disingenuous for a highly educated academic and well-practiced scientific communicator in a position of significant authority and influence to publish to the general public as is, without considering the need to carefully qualify the scope of his claim to truth, so as to avoid any possible misunderstanding by his audience, yet insist he didn't expect any such misunderstanding to arise, which would suggest that he actually fully intended for such a misunderstanding to arise and had insidious ulterior motives for publishing it in light of this fact, given the sensitive nature of the topics in question, and the fact that it should have been obvious for someone as accustomed as he was to presenting truth claims in a way that minimizes any chance of misunderstanding or distortion by the target audience, that it was inevitably going to be misunderstood and/or distorted by not only the target audience, but also by all of the various movements that would seek to weaponize it to foist their cultural and political agendas onto wider society, including those movements he himself was a part of and whose agendas he had an obvious personal interest in supporting, some of which were suspiciously hostile to the interests of Wolfians. It's worth clarifying that the anti-captain movement, as spearheaded by Professor Catherine Dunkirk, is vehemently opposed to the Unmowed et al., not just because they are typically captain supporters, but also since Dunkirk's movement is generally against science and reason, and the Mower show is very precious to it as a powerful example of how the world can come together in peace and rally around something without an obvious rational basis. Hence anti-captains are often particularly deeply invested in the Mower show, and their wish on it, perhaps none more so than Dunkirk herself, even though she infamously refuses to reveal her wish. As outrageous as Bleat Lamb's ideas are to wider society, to say nothing of his insensitive conduct and strongly suspected hateful prejudices, his own community increasingly consider him to not go far enough, with many even suggesting that, on rational balance, a reappraisal of the unicorns and their social control methods may be necessary to find an ultimate solution. Some have started to use more than words to express their views. The name King Benartram's personal guard was changed from Mower Force to Shining Force to try and encourage people to join, since recruits were leaving out of getting fed up of Benartram and his Mower fanaticism. It hasn't really helped. He was about to drop the new name anyway, what with the upcoming great name change and all, but now it's settled. It's common for eons to refer to the animal they are named after, and evolved from, as their spirit animal. The idea is that eons tend to feel they have a spiritual connection to their evolutionary ancestor, which they describe as a deep bond they share. Eons derive some instinctual traits from their spirit animal, but applied in an eon context, such as a fear or aversion to certain other species of eon, who derived from certain species of animal, and they tend to feel that the difference between themselves and said spirit animal is not as profound as humans mostly feel about it. With regard to such shared traits, examples include the Mouse eon's instinctual fear of cations, the bird eon's natural desire to sing, and all of the wolf eon's notorious urges, including the desire to hunt and eat chicken eons, and a general lust for blood, gore, and violently rough, predatory intercourse. In contrast, humans tend to refer to an eon's evolutionary ancestor as their counterpart and perceive a gulf between sapient beings and their ancestors. The term counterpart has historically gone without question, but has in recent years developed a certain stigma. Increasing numbers of eons are coming to see the word as insulting and reflective of the human inclination to view one's immediate evolutionary ancestor as fundamentally unrelatable and beneath them. It's still a polarizing issue. As to what extent this is true, while there is little dispute that humans have traditionally seen eons as beneath them, the idea that humans have this view of ancestry in general has been called into question, with critics citing the way humans have always viewed monkeys roughly as equals, to suggest that the growing stigma against the word counterpart lacks foundation. On the other hand, in support of their argument, eons point to the obvious fact that monkeys are effectively eons, in all but name, being the immediate evolutionary ancestor of humans, and yet never referred to as their counterpart, and possessing a sapience that modern scientists are struggling to differentiate from that of humans. For that matter, eons are also becoming emboldened to question what makes humans and monkeys so special, and some even go so far as to dare suggest there's no legitimate reason for the distinction between humans/monkeys and eons to exist in the first place, other than to perpetuate old-fashioned preconceptions about species supremacy. In spite of the rising spirit of equality among the species in recent times, humans and monkeys are broadly hostile to this suggestion, insistent on still being distinguished from the broader eon community, which many eons feel is proof of their hypocrisy, holding back the modern efforts to make things better for eonikind. The standard rebuttal by humans is that they should have to step down from their own level in order to raise eons up, but many eons see this as just a cop-out by humans, who want to avoid making the kinds of sacrifices that they would be making if they truly cared about the plight of their eon cousins over their own selfish desire to exploit a status quo that is blatantly favorable to themselves. In any case, the debate rages on. The dragons' tributes and burnonations came to an end after Lava Reef, and yet the tensions are now growing more than ever before. The dragon's vague respect for the Holy Child is about the only thing holding things together, and even that thread can only hold for so long. It's all bound to come to a head one day. Dragon culture is poorly understood outside of the dragon tribes themselves. The understanding of it by humans, monkeys, and eons is largely speculative and unconfirmed in nature. The most well-evidenced beliefs are that dragons are very tribal, living in broods, in faraway and inaccessible places such as mountains, that they are exceedingly proud, and look down on all non-dragons as inferior beings, with the rumored exception of unicorns, and that they believe very strongly in a pagan religion declared to be groundless heathenry by the captaincy, which at least partly revolves around dragons having an inalienable right of draconic supremacy over all things. One of the most infamous old beliefs about dragons was that they kill and eat their own parents as part of their coming of age. This well-known notion was largely dismissed as obvious anti-dragon propaganda, even by non-dragons, until dragon diplomats eventually confirmed it to be true, albeit qualifying that it's done out of respect, and that it's customary to wait for the parents to become elderly and infirm before doing this. The perception is that they're being put out of their misery and sped forth on their journey to Dragonland, where they'll be forever happy under the loving care of the dragon gods. When pressed to comment on whether this killing culture was consensual, the diplomats were noticeably evasive. The matter became a source of great shock and scandal in non-dragon society, who had mostly come to dismiss the rumor by that point, and it arguably revived the anti-dragon attitudes that the world was mostly trying to overcome, hard as this was in itself. There soon followed resurgences of the ancient and unevidenced myths that the dragon somehow sold out the wider world to the unicorns and watched on as it burned amid a slew of other ugly conspiracy theories, culminating in a dredging up of the incendiary old blood pact belief that many human Indian children who go missing have actually been whisked away by dragons and sacrificed to their bloodthirsty gods. It wasn't long thereafter that the sliver of cord remaining in diplomatic relations was severed. Lava Reef came much later, putting a decisive end to absolutely everything. The Journal of Acceptable Scientific Truth, or JAST, is one of the most prestigious scientific journals in Arvich, with most scientists dying to get their research work in there, literally, as it's a common practice for professors to kill their research associates via poisoning in order to claim ownership of their work. This popular approach to scientific practice is known as plagiarism, and is somewhat controversial, since most of the academics who do it have been granted a special status called tenure that renders it impossible to hold them to account for their actions or fire them for any reason. The conditions on which tenure is conferred are seen as vague and unclear, although the academic establishment is fiercely defensive of it. It's been noted that the most common victims of plagiarism are doctoral students and junior researchers, although many of them report that they've had their work stolen from them without being killed, and have been met with a brick wall by the academic establishment when they tried to seek redress for this. For that matter, such younger researchers, in addition to many undergraduate students, have reported different kinds of abuse from tenured professors, especially from Walfians, which they claim has been similarly covered up. The orthodox stance of most academic institutions, especially the so-called Holy League of Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, Harvard, and Berkeley, is that these claims are baseless, citing research from the JAST to support their position, and branding those who object as anti-intellectual an accusation that is effectively a career death sentence for any student or researcher accused. The theme of professional misconduct by Walfians in the education system has been picked up by the Arvichia News, who argue that Walfians should be blocked from holding such positions completely until we figure out what the luck's going on with their species. Wolfons are offended by the suggestion that there's anything going on with their species that they haven't been tirelessly campaigning to draw wider society's attention to for centuries, but it's also come as no surprise to them, as the Arvichia News has a habit of taking aggressive stances against the interests of eons on what they insist are logical and rational grounds that have nothing to do with any kind of prejudice against them. Some have looked up the newspaper's archives and suggested this is not fully in line with its editorial stance from past decades that all eons are putrid counterfeit abominations before the captain, who should be systematically genocided through a scientific program known as unbreeding. The Arvichia News has responded to such claims by campaigning to have such accusers executed along with everybody in a 3-mile radius of where they live. Anyway, with regard to academic tenure, some commentators have questioned the appropriateness of an institution that gives workers complete impunity from any meaningful consequences for their actions. In particular, they feel a problem reveals itself in the case of notorious agenda-driven firebrand academics who are widely perceived to incite and inflame intolerance, like Doc Bleatlam, Catherine Dunkirk, Laurie Cross, D.C. Whiteley, Mary Sherry, Stephanie Redmond, Muzi Songdab, Jermaine Greer, Kinder Surmise, Niles Palmer, Morton Heidegger, Barton Woofer, Lionel Dennett, Timothée Leary, Fried Reisnietsk, Bomjek Slothage, Naim Choosgummy, and Oriath Storky, among many others. It's been countered that academics are clever, so it's okay that those questioning such academics' use of their influential position to promulgate whatever messages they please are merely trying to mute anyone saying things they don't want to hear, and moreover that something like the tenure principle applies to the Arvikayan aristocracy and Emperor Demarek himself, who no self-respecting Arvikayan would ever even dream of questioning, so there's clearly nothing wrong with it. Bleatlam will not retract his statement about Shiwalfian cubs. Dunkirk calls for a science-cultural revolution. Cross wants round-world denialists neutered. Sherry wanted eons out of the toilets. Redmond wants women to accept their probable inferiority. Heidegger and Woofer want the focus groups to return. Dennett wanted diplomats to stop humoring the dragons and their obviously false gods. He disclaims responsibility for love reef. Fried Rice wants slavery back. Leary encouraged young impressionable misfits to abandon society and drink blackcurrant juice all day. Naim still denies that the damning ever happened. Storky adds that even if it had happened, it wouldn't count as a genocide. The Slimian/Maozian half-breed intellectual agitator Flubbert Antler Watson has recently been hijacking wireless broadcasts to spread his subversive messages in a similar manner to the Domritic. Watson is a countercultural crusader who argues that society and all of its institutions, belief systems, values, practices, customs, and conventions are fraudulent, tyrannical, domineering illusions, and that everybody except him and a small set of like-minded individuals are blind to the arbitrary, groundless, immaterial nature of all such things. Watson has described himself as an equal opportunities eviscerator of sacred cows, taking aim at every kind of cultural totem pole around which anybody anywhere gravitates, from science to religion to politics to wizardry to art to music to literally anything that a label could ever be ascribed to. He argues that fixed, rigid beliefs and attitudes of any sort are superstitious, mindless, ignorant, and dangerous. He especially feels that science and magic, together with their models and methods, are entirely illusory in nature, and that society has been drowning in them for so long that people are blind to this. In spite of his professed position that he does not believe in anything and that he is free from all bias or prejudice in his thought processes, some commentators feel that Watson exhibits a painfully obvious set of persistent, inflexible, underlying views and attitudes in all of his writings, which include a fixation with anarchism, unbelief, radical north-wing ideologies and projects, individual freedom, an extreme distrust of authority, and a deep-seated hatred of organized religion. Perhaps his most well-known such fixation manifests in his psychedelic drug advocacy, in which he seems to perceive a profound and inherent value, in spite of the ever-mounting evidence that persistent indulgence in such drugs over time can have harmful, addictive, mind-rotting effects, which some argue Watson himself is a good case study for, as his statements have become progressively more muddled and incoherent over time. In particular, Watson continues to put a lot of stock in what he calls anomalous phenomena, which to him are indications that reality is not the orderly entity it's popularly believed to be and is actually fundamentally chaotic in nature, while paradoxically still showing signs of a purposeful yet mischievous intelligent design. He holds to these suspicions in spite of the complete lack of scientific evidence. Such thing as TEH case. Comparisons with Watson have been made with the so-called Mad Wolf, Grace Fluffery, and her infamous obsession with not believing in anything and viewing all things as completely and utterly meaningless. Watson decries these similarities, arguing that Grace is just as poisoned by superstitious attachments as everybody else, citing her utterly unevidenced religious faith and her unique conception of the captain, and the unhealthily obsessive and obnoxious manner in which she constantly expresses this faith to everybody everywhere at all times. Grace, on being informed about this statement, has in turn condemned Watson, snarling that Watson is misguided if he thinks that he's getting one over on the captain in any way with his retreat into the willful and consciously absurd manipulation of supposedly arbitrary cultural artifacts, like he's so fond of doing. To Grace, the captain's absolute, supreme domination is inescapable by any measure, and if anything, Watson is playing directly into his omnipotent hands by suggesting otherwise. Watson has subsequently responded that he isn't trying to get one over something he doesn't believe even exists, saying Grace can't even see past her blind faith in the captain to recognize where he's coming from. He has further accused Grace of hypocrisy in failing to justify the existence of this captain that she cleaves to so zealously in trying to discredit his and everybody else's position on anything she disagrees with, citing her circular reasoning as yet another example of the kind of mindless, rigid, inflexible thinking that he takes objection to. Off the back of this, some commentators have noted that while his objections to Grace's views and behaviors are valid and popularly shared, his own relentless opposition to supposedly mindless, rigid, inflexible thinking comes across in and of itself suspiciously like a form of mindless, rigid, inflexible thinking. In any case, for his relentless crusading against all things orthodoxian, Watson is on very good terms with the wider deviant movement, like Professor Catherine Dunkirk and recent convert the Boppenbertian, even as he distances himself from them on the basis of their rapidly deepening tribalism, populism, and identity politicking, which he takes great exception to. Trainsby the Great is an eccentric aristocrat who has a well-known feud with the glassy Xian Dr. Kawashina, always challenging him to hat-throwing contests. The good doctor always loses since he has no arms, being a sapient pair of glasses. Unfortunately, Trainsby spends so much time running around throwing his hats that the peasants under his jurisdiction are living in squalor. Not that that's anything unusual in Arvich. Professor Doc Bleetlam, the infamous Unmowed academic, has always been controversial outside of his own small but vocal community. Said community, however, is becoming increasingly split within itself. A growing factionalism is mounting between so-called extreme and super-extreme Unmowed apologists, the chief distinguishing characteristics of which being violence advocacy, which the extreme group rejects while the super-extreme group refuses to rule it out, and political affiliation, where the super-extreme group tend to be liberative, viewing identity politics concerning underprivileged and vulnerable groups in society as irrational, whereas the extreme group lean towards concerebral attitudes and feel its opposition to such identity politics that is irrational, believing that strong political action on behalf of more mainstream, well-established, secure groups and cultural entities is what's truly irrational. The dichotomy is most famously manifested in the divide between Bleetlam, extreme, and his peer, Professor Kinder Surmise, super, extreme. Ironically, chief among the factors seen to be responsible for this very bitter division are some of the more unsavory sentiments Bleetlam has been increasingly manifesting that have shocked and appalled even the Unmowed movement, who can't believe he would harbor such hateful attitudes, even though pretty much everybody outside of said movement feel that similar such hateful attitudes had been plainly evident in the man along with just about everybody else in the Unmowed movement for their entire history. One of the most recent such incidents concerns an event where one of Bleetlam's fellow Unmowed, a Shiwalfian doctoral student, reported an uncomfortable incident in a stairwell in which a male Walfian professor began making aggressive physical advances on her against her will. The encounter ended before it went any farther, as some fellow wolves arrived before it had the chance to. The subsequently deeply disturbed student reported this incident to her colleagues and word spread, to which Bleetlam responded as part of a universally accessible, wireless broadcasted, widely circulated address, that the she-wolf had been asking for it, and that her frigid attitude to the professor accosting her was a shameful mark against her moral character. He justified his last comment by claiming she was disrespectful to those persecuted victims of the unreasonable, backwards Far West culture who were forced to wear their repressive face masks and hence couldn't kiss anyone, and that anybody who disagreed with him on these points was a coward, false reasonable, or worse, an open unreasonable. Upon being challenged on the perceived insensitivity of his remarks, Bleetlam, rather than backing down, instead went further, stating that he had no sympathy for she-wolves who make claims of sexual assault, as his doctoral student did, citing the well-established scientific research on Wolfian sexual behavior, and arguing from it that since she-wolves are natural sexual submissives, who have been scientifically proven to experience intense pleasure from being dominated, her encounter was part of a rational culture, however much it upset her, and that only an unreasonable would stand against it. Some have accused the Sheripian Bleat Lamb of having sinister ulterior motives for his uncompromising position, seeing this incident as the latest in a very well-storied series of bigoted statements he has been making for decades with regard to Wolfians of both sexes. Despite the efforts of literally the entire Wolfian faculty to have the unnamed Wolfian abuser identified and forcibly removed from his position, the Cambridge University administration refused to take any action against the tenured professor, arguing that he worked very hard to earn his position, which means he no longer has to earn anything ever again. They similarly refused to fire or otherwise restrict Bleat Lamb himself, who continues to unreservedly express his view on his former student's encounter at every chance he gets, using all of the resources afforded to him by his employer to do so. The administration also denied the strong suspicions among Bleat Lamb's academic fraternity that he knows who the abuser is, and secretly petitioned on his behalf to keep him on. The abused Wolfian student withdrew from academia shortly after Bleat Lamb's first public announcement on the topic, and no reports of her whereabouts have been forthcoming ever since. Bleat Lamb has responded to rumors of suicide by saying there are no rational or empirical, which is to say reasonable, grounds for such a concern, and that in any case he would disclaim responsibility for it if there were, remarking that he was simply stating the facts, disapproval of which can only be an indication of unreasonability. Rupert Beardoxwell is in charge of the Arvichia News, the Empire's best and only newspaper. Although he of course reports to Emperor Damaric, who is the absolute head of all things in the Empire, Beardoxwell is also in charge of all other imperial information dissemination entities. Beardoxwell is respected by most citizens now that the entire country have undergone re-education establishment processing. Before this happened though, he did face a degree of criticism when he decided to secretly withdraw the entire pension fund of the Arvichia News Corporation to spend on a wild gambling session at Casino Damaric. He acknowledged it may have been irresponsible to act so surreptitiously, and so he didn't make a secret of his subsequent plan to withhold his employees' wages for the month and use them to win the money back at the casino in order to pay for the funerals of all the retired employees who starved to death without any pension money to buy food. Unfortunately, this plan didn't work out, leading to 72% of the company's employees starving to death from the missing wages that month. In regretful response to this tragic development, Beardoxwell lobbied the government to grant him permission to seize all the personal finances and assets of the remaining 28% of employees left alive, which was successful, and, as he left for the casino again, he assured the oddly anxious workers that he was due and would definitely win this time. As luck would have it, he actually did, recovering all of the losses he had previously incurred. However, he decided it was only right that he pay all the money to himself since he had worked very hard to try and win it back in the first place. This led to a problem when the remaining employees starved to death due to having both no wages for the month and no personal wealth to fall back on, and there was nobody left in the organization, beneath the upper management level, to write and publish the newspaper. The enterprise found its feet again eventually, and Rupert Beardoxwell went on record as saying some mistakes may have possibly been sort of made maybe in certain areas according to some people, and we give our sincerest and most heartfelt apologies that they feel that way, which largely satisfied critics. However, some citizens came to feel that Rupert Beardoxwell bore some personal responsibility for the deaths of almost every worker in his company, and that he should be held accountable for his actions, with a few even going so far as to suggest he should be removed from his position. These attitudes were recently confirmed in peer-reviewed scientific research conducted by the newspaper's biggest sponsor to have derived from an early strain of the Mind virus that said sponsor is trying to cure. The particular suggestion that Beardoxwell be removed from his job was a strong tip-off that the mind virus had set in, as it's unthinkable for a corporate executive to be fired, sacked, or made redundant in Arvich. The only way they can lose their job is if they step down a concept whose meaning is not fully understood, or even faintly understood for that matter, but which only seems to apply to people in positions of great power and authority. Some commentators have speculated that it's just a pretentious way of saying they've been fired that is used in an insidious attempt to illegitimately avoid the negative connotations of the standard term. The reasons as to why people in positions of great power and authority that fire other people in positions of great power and authority would want to remove such negative connotations are a complete mystery. However, it's been suggested that it's an absurd double standard, that such concern for the good reputation of people who have been forcibly removed from their job due to their own incompetence or corruption should only apply to people in positions of great power and authority, the consequences of whose incompetence and corruption would surely be vastly more far-reaching and problematic than those of any lower-level worker whose employer wouldn't hesitate to announce had been fired in disgrace and subsequently refused to give any kind of reference for their future employment prospects. This sort of objection to the concept of stepping down is currently undergoing analysis to determine whether or not it's a product of the mind virus. It's too early to say with confidence, but preliminary results do tend to indicate that it is, which I'm sure you'll be astonished to learn. The Bestia Broadcasting Corporation, or BBC for short, are rather notorious for their refusal to play Eldar's music, which some perceive to reveal a bias against Eldar theirself, and possibly against transsexuals in general. The BBC have denied this allegation, saying that they're just fed up of the overexposure Eldar's music gets. Many see this as a valid point of complaint, but also feel the BBC's claim is inconsistent with things like their proven collaboration with the Bestia Central Police to try and convict Eldar of operating a child abuse network that they claim runs to the heart of the BBC's biggest rival, an allegation later determined to have absolutely no foundation to it whatsoever, and that nobody other than the BBC's executive team had ever accused Eldar or the rival of doing in the first place. Such actions seem a little extreme to some, and there's also an impression that the BBC is trying to muddy Eldar's reputation in order to help promote their own idol, James Squinastalebi, a man who the organization have aggressively promoted for decades and continue to support as their biggest star in spite of his complete lack of any apparent talent, charisma, or likability. It's popularly suspected that James himself had something to do with the company's attempt to incriminate Eldar and the rival broadcast corporation that sponsors Eldar, MTB, or Me Too You Bestia. This has led to the popular phrase among Eldar's fans, James fixed it, in reference to this deep-seated suspicion. The BBC, however, insist this is not the case, and have taken a break in their latest Eon Orphanage tour to ask that the public don't buy into groundless conspiracy theories that have absolutely no foundation to them whatsoever. The U isn't part of the official acronym due to a legal dispute with the tree Eon, who originally gave his name to the MTB organization. Some scandalous events have been unfolding with regard to Borald Simpson, the totally and utterly disgraced former Bestia president, who was kicked out of politics with a multi-million-pound annual pension and severance package, for which both he and his party insisted he had worked very hard. After being stripped of all respect, dignity, and status within his own country, Baron Lord Sir Simpson vented that he was a voice of the little people, who had been stitched up by the concerebral elite. He threw his 24-carat gold-trimmed top hat, cape, and monocle to the floor, stormed out of Parliament, and emigrated to mainland Arvich, upon which he was immediately headhunted by Rupert Beardoxwell and employed on an enormous wage to write for his national tabloid, the Arvichia News, after receiving a glowing reference from Simpson's previous employer, who had fired him in complete and utter disgrace several hours earlier. Simpson has been given a weekly column in the publication, in which he has proceeded to rant about how bad his former country is, and how Arvich is actually the true bastion of freedom and liberty that Bestia pretends to be. Some have accused Simpson of selling out to a genocidal, totalitarian, tyrannical dictatorship in exchange for money and power, and in so doing providing a conclusive demonstration of the moral bankruptcy and complete disintegrity for which he was removed from his original position of power in the first place. Sumpson has thoroughly and incisively responded to these critics by saying that they're just jealous, putting the matter to bed for good, and he has subsequently written a series of columns decrying the politics of envy and culture of entitlement that have corrupted Bestia. In the absence of the glorious and irreproachable glory of Arvich, that's so glorious that it should gloriously annex Bestia and save them gloriously from their inglorious selves. Right, where's my paycheck? Wait, didn't mean to write that last bit. Where did I put the eraser? I can't find it. Well, whatever, Bestia sucks. Borld's columns have taken a more sinister turn recently, as he's been accused of trying to incite riots in Bestia's capital, in particular trying to encourage his supporters to storm the old house of Mower, which also serves as King Bremner's castle and the center of Bestian aristocratic politics, and forcibly remove the powers that be in order to help pave the way for an Arvikian invasion. Borld has categorically denied the baseless rumors that he was trying to incite any such thing when he wrote, "You Bestians should storm the old house of Mower, capture and kill King Bremner and every other person you can find there, and open up the great walls of Bestia in order for Emperor Demarek to come and reclaim your fake country as part of his glorious empire." He contends that his statement was sufficiently vague that nobody can prove he meant anything by it, and that because of this, his critics are wrong. While the Bestian media is divided over this point, whispers of riots have been spreading through the nation, and in fact the old house of Mower was breached just yesterday by a group of political agitators. The Daily Bestia characterized this invading force as a righteous group of valiant freedom fighters making a noble, heroic stand against all the entitled elites who have poisoned contemporary Bestian politics with their nonsense about left-hander persecution and eon underprivilege. The Bestia Times meanwhile characterized this invading force as a frothing, bloodthirsty, vicious mob of savage humans consumed with bigoted rage and bursting with the disgusting desire to horribly butcher the entire Bestian aristocratic establishment, which is an excoriating testament to their visceral hatred of eons, poor people, transsexuals, Marxists, concerebrals, intellectuals, and every other group in society that needs our support in the current year. However, wider Bestian society tends to feel both of these characterizations are inconsistent with the reality of the event, in which by all accounts the rioters seemed more to be a random bunch of general malcontents swept up in an excited crowd fever, to the point they were emboldened to break into the building, whereupon they proceeded to just kind of awkwardly shuffle about from room to room, as if their bravado had instantly faded upon entering the castle, and they weren't really sure what they were even doing there. The death toll from this incident has also been confirmed to be comprised entirely of the rioters themselves, owing to their heavy-handed treatment by the castle's hyper-anxious security force. In any case, both papers refused to retract their statements. Delayists, like Cybele aka Bibale, believe the scheduling of the Mower show is not absolute, and that once enacted, it can safely be overturned and or postponed without this compromising the wish-granting effects of the Mower show. Schedulists, on the other hand, believe that once scheduled, the Mower show must go ahead at the specified date and time, or else nobody's wish on the Mower show will ever come true. The overwhelming majority of Mower show believers are schedulists, with delayism having quite a stigma attached to it, being seen as naive, wishful thinking, entitled, and immature, among other negative things. For that matter, the overwhelming majority of people across the entire known world are Mower show believers, taking for granted the idea that a wish on the Mower show will come true when the show happens. A relatively small minority are on the fence about whether the wishes will really come true. Only a very small minority of people explicitly disbelieve in the Mower show, most of them being far Westerners, re-educated Arvikians, and members of the Unmowed movement. Attendists, like Hayward aka Captain Bullseye, believe that one must physically attend the Mower show for their wish to come true. Non-attendists think it doesn't matter whether one actually goes to the show or not, as long as they've made their Mower show wish in advance. Rewishists believe that once a wish has been formally made, it can be revoked and or replaced. Monowishists, like Wolfkid, believe that once made, a wish cannot be altered or retracted. It should be clarified that the idea that ultimately only one wish will come true per person is universally accepted, with absolutely nobody but naive children under the impression that one can expect multiple of their wishes to be granted. Ritualists, like Eldar aka Pivar, believe that a wish on the Mower show has to be made in accordance with a formal wishing ritual of some sort, the most orthodox being to clasp one's hands together and explicitly state one's wish out loud while looking up at the Mower star. Iconoclasts believe such rituals are completely superstitious and superfluous and redundant. Anti-iconoclasts believe that iconoclasts are unreasonable in their views. Anti-iconoclasts think that anti-iconoclasts are unreasonable in their view, that iconoclasts are unreasonable in their view, that ritualists are unreasonable. There are more variations on this, but you probably get the picture by now, so I'll cut it off here for the sake of your sanity. Although most people aren't ritualists, they still tend to adopt wishing rituals anyway. In spite of the divisions in Mower show belief, which can get quite heated and have led to some civil unrest at a rate that is popularly sensed to be rising rapidly, there are many beliefs about the Mower show on which there is effectively no disagreement among those who don't doubt the show. One is that for any given wisher, no more than one dead person can be wished back to life, although the matter of whether there is a limit on how many living people can be affected by a single wish is very polarizing. Many people choose to make relatively humble, restrained wishes in order to avoid disappointment in this regard, although that doesn't stop most people. Another nigh-universal belief is that negative wishes will not come true, such as wishes to explicitly hurt or kill people, wishes to damage or disrupt a country's economy, and things like that. This has led to some concern on the part of the many people who have wished for an end to the Arvich Empire and its tyrannical horrors, many of whom have carefully specified their wishes in a way that they hope will bypass this restriction. The private maguls are in the headlights these days regarding the long-standing rumors about their teaching practices. In particular, those reported by alumni of the venerable Bestian boarding maguls of Arrow and Heaton, which were attended by almost every single person in a position of power or authority in Arvich, except Emperor Damaric, who refused to go to any kind of school at all. A considerable number of former students have been coming out with stories about private lessons they were made to undertake at very late hours, which they say disrupted their sleeping schedules and thus caused them some discomfort as a result. The predominantly Walfian staff, who have been accused of giving such lessons, are shocked and disgusted by the strangely accusatory tone of the allegations, arguing that they were important to build character and toughen the children up for the real world. The former students insist that the executives, who have denied all knowledge of this practice, were fully aware of it and deliberately covered it up so as to avoid reputational damage and the subsequent loss of profits that this would have entailed if the students' parents had found out and withdrawn their children from the organization. The executives have assured parents that they put the well-being of their students before all other concerns, with vaguely defined methods now supposedly in place to prevent this sort of thing from happening again, and ask the parents to kindly continue paying the $300,000 annual tuition fees to ensure their children receive the best introduction to the real world available. The teachers accused were fired in disgrace, although some of the former students still object to the fact that they were immediately rehired by rival maguls, with glowing references from their previous employer. There's also a perception that the aggrieved former students, who are all now affluent people in positions of high standing within the Arvikian establishment, aren't revealing the full details as to the content of these private lessons for some reason. On this point, some investigators claim to have interviewed the famous anonymous Walfian conductor of the magical train that transports all children around the world to and from their maguls at the start and end of each term. On being asked by these journalists if he had any idea what these former students might be concealing, the conductor's reply, which appears to have been universal based on all the interviewers' independent testimonies, was, "Not by the hair on my chinny chin," with him adding that the former students' complaints seemed like a load of old huff and puff. Off the back of all this, in spite of his apparent skepticism, the conductor was moved to personally address the former students directly over a wireless broadcast that he somehow transmitted from his own train, intimating how he would be happy to come pick them up individually on his train, driving them back to the former home of an old friend's grandmother that he had inherited long ago. There, he assured they could approach him personally to express their grievances, and he closed his broadcast by saying with a palpable pleasure in his deep, growly voice that their doing so would make it all the better to hear them with, "My dears." The Unmowed and deviants have started to gain some ground with the wider public via endorsement by some high-profile celebrities. These figures include the Hojian Gristle P. Baconese and the Brayadian actor/comedian Levinstein, who have been using their platform to spread anti-Mower show sentiments. They have a tendency to identify Mower show belief with basically all the problems in the modern world, arguing people are only moved to place their faith in it by ignorance and fear, and other such factors. The celebrities pine for the golden age of pre-Mower society, looking back with a particular fondness to the ancient peaks, one of the earliest recorded civilizations from over 300 years ago, who they insist had very progressive views that we should be inspired to return to, citing their tolerance of left-handedness as a prominent example of such views. While these celebrities' grievances are typically expressed through rational argument, some take umbrage with the evident visceral contempt and bitterness that they exhibit in all of their discourse on the subject, always characterizing the Mower show and its advocates in extremely negative and unflattering terms whenever they get the chance. They continue to deny the rumors that their transparently emotive disposition towards the Mower show and its supporters owes far more to the strongly suspected fact that these celebrities, all of whom are left-handed, experience persecution during the historical Mower menace period. This was an infamous phase from over 2 decades ago during which left-handers were falsely implicated in a plot to blow up the old House of Mo and stop the Mower show, which formed the impetus for a period of renewed left-hander persecution in Bestia. That would have been at its height when all of these celebrities were teenagers, which was typically the time of life during which left-handers back then saw through their rightful indoctrination and began questioning their hand identity. People of this opinion have put it to these celebrities that their ongoing publicly heaped scorn against the Mower show comes across as increasingly out of touch in the modern era in which no such association of left-handers with anti-Mower show terrorism exists outside of dwindling fringe groups, and that in any case the persecution of left-handers is broadly regretted bitterly by the vast majority of not only the wider public, but especially by Mower show enthusiasts, many of whom have made their wish to bring a permanent end to the stigma against the left-handed. It's further been recognized, following the Wars of the Hands, that the hateful historical treatment of the left-handed by Mower show apologists was likely a manifestation of a much deeper cultural tradition of scapegoating the left-handed for all of society's problems, dating back from far before the Mower show was even a concept, and cutting to the very heart of almost all societies and cultures. It's currently theorized that the long-standing persecution of the left-handed is more likely owed to a combination of there being a minority group that deviates conspicuously from orthodox societal norms and conventions, and the fact that such groups are convenient scapegoats for wider society to offload all of their problems onto. With regard to the left-handed celebrities' lionization of the ancient peaks and their tolerant and enlightened culture, such objections are similarly raised. While there is indeed evidence to suggest the ancient peaks had a uniquely tolerant attitude towards left-handed men, their attitude toward left-handed women was intensely hateful even by modern standards, and it's now believed that the collapse of their society followed a genocide campaign against such women, in which the peaks were swept up into a frenzy that blew out of all proportion, to the point that they ended up killing every single female in the country, leading to the whole civilization dying off completely, although not before they had attempted to conquer and subjugate the entire known world on the grounds they all needed to be saved from themselves and their filthy non-beak nature. In any case, the celebrities in question deny that the alleged antiquated left-handed identity politics play any part in their position in relation to the Mower show, and insist that they are motivated by purely rational considerations. Incidentally, the Mower menace period culminated in a patsy known only as V. Foxhall being tricked into transporting hundreds of barrels of demonite into the old House of Mo's basement, on the false understanding they contained hedge trimmers. Upon being accosted by the guards, and realizing he'd been set up, he falsely identified himself as John Johnson, only escaping because the guards fell to the ground in fits of laughter at how pathetic his blatantly fake name was. Professor Doc Bleatlam is disgusted by the anti-manifestation evolutionism within the captaincy, saying it's the worst crisis the captain'd have ever faced, and that the forces of unreason are trying to poison the captaincy from within with their superstitious nonsense that Goskireth and his demonics must be whispering into their ears. He was recently moved to march the 200 meters from his 50-room Bensington mansion up to the old house of Mower, a building he sees as emblematic of this new breed of superstitious, ritualistic, unmanifested garbage, whereupon he angrily nailed a roll of scientific paper onto the front door that listed 100 manifest literacy principles on the basis of which the unmanifest heresy of things, like the Mower show, need to be stamped out in order to save our souls from the forces of unreason. Among these principles were things like, the manifest is absolute and literally true in its assertions on all counts. The manifest's truth claims and recommendations take precedence over those of all worldly powers, including those of the captaincy and any of its clergy and representatives. All claims to scientific truth in the manifest are, or will eventually be, empirically verifiable in accordance with orthodox scientific procedure, as outlined in the manifest. There is no manifest-supported basis for belief in the supernatural or magical power of rituals, icons, charms, mantras, wishes, or Mower shows, and similarly there is no such basis for belief in any kind of supernatural creatures, entities, or deities other than the Captain, Guskireth, and the demonics. No unmanifested claim to truth can ever be made with any authority, unless it has undergone peer-reviewed academic screening subject to the intense rigors of the scientific method or one of its acceptable variations, as laid out in the manifest, page 5952, paragraph 35, subsections 18 to 993. While many people share sympathy to a certain extent with some of the principles Bleatlam stated on his manifest literacy document, they find the smug certitude of the convictions expressed therein, together with the manner of expression and alarmist urgency with which he expressed them, to be characteristic of Bleatlam and his Unmowed movement, especially with regard to its deeply hostile, presumptuous, and self-righteous character. While Bleatlam continues to publicly insist that he is a pacifist and harbors no ill will towards those he calls unreasonables, unlike his infamous peer Professor Kinder surmise, many commentators sense that Bleatlam's attitudes are destined to degenerate into precisely those kinds of attitudes he currently decries, anticipating that eventually Bleatlam will indeed expose his true colors and begin to advocate for far more sinister things to be done about his much maligned forces of unreason. They similarly wonder about what actions other malevolent forces might one day be inspired to take off the back of Bleatlam's ramblings, either presently, or at some point in the far-flung future, which is a suggestion of particular offense to Bleatlam, who refers to the complete lack of empirical evidence for the existence of any such forces, as a sign of its inherent unreasonableness. Bensington, the district where Professor Bleatlam lives, is one of the most affluent areas in Bestia, and as coincidence would have it is also home to the residences of approximately 96% of all significant figures of prominence and influence in Bestian society, including aristocrats, businessmen, politicians, academics, pop singers, voice actors, and cheese collectors. In particular, one of the very few members of the aristocracy who don't live there is King Benetram, aka King Bremner, whose home away from the old house of Mower is a rather low-key hovel on the poorer side of Bestia's capital city, which he moved into over 30 years ago, and never felt the need to move up the property ladder from. Unlike most aristocrats, who choose to operate from Bensington even when the region they govern is hundreds of miles away, Bremner has said he prefers to live in solidarity with the general Bestian public, who mostly live in relative destitution, and who broadly find everything the residents of Bensington care about, believe in, feel, think, want, and do to be completely and utterly unrelatable on every single level imaginable, in spite of said Bensington residents actively exercising enormous control over the country and claiming in doing so to represent all of its citizens, their interests, and what's best for them. There was one aristocrat, Tory Brewert, who made a very public point of moving in with the destitute for several minutes, once a week, returning to his Bensington mansion. In between such visits, although some suspected the Libvative leadership hopeful of an ulterior motive, IJN, the world-famous game set newsletter, has been accused of taking money from infamous game set developer LGN to unfairly hype up their horrible game sets, above all the ones that have been dug up in the excavations. IJN continue to deny this, but the suspicions just never die down. The rumors of pro-LGN bias are partly fueled by the fact IJN has undergone several name changes over the years. Their original name was the LGN Fun Club, and this was followed up with LGN power until they settled on the suspiciously LGN-esque IJN. The IJN organization have explained that they just used LGN to stand for lots of games now, and it's a complete coincidence that it's identical to the name of the company, whose advertisements now cover 95% of their newsletters pages. Curiously, however, they refuse to explain what IJN stands for. Still, some people feel like the old reviewers of Jove City might have been onto something about IJN being corrupt and having bad taste in games. IJN's writers are well known for their position that Nintendo's Mario is just a fat dumb plumber with games that suck as much as his plunger, and Sega's Sonic is an overfast pile of spikes on sneakers, whereas LGN's E.T. is the greatest game set of all time. LGN's Big Rigs is a fantastic, hyper-realistic truck-eon simulator, and LGN's Action 52 was an incredible mix of visionary experiences wrapped in an affordable package at just $599 Arvich. During the now dead and buried Dragon Reconciliation Project, humans and eons tried to share their culture with the dragons, including their game set things. This backfired quite badly, with the dragons taking umbrage to the fact their kind is frequently presented as villains in these game sets, who the invariably human and eon heroes have to slay to progress. Nevertheless, some dragons did take well to them, with favorites including Godzilla Games, Peasant Quest, Destroy All Humans, and Barbie's Fashion Adventure. Some human diplomats noted that in spite of their cultural isolation from humanity and eonity, the dragons appeared to recognize the concept of game sets, as well as many of the other objects and devices that had been dug up in the excavations, almost as though they had some ancestral memory of the times when they were originally created. As with much else, the dragons refused to confirm or deny such notions, reportedly often responding with the phrase, like parents, like children. This has fueled the long-standing, though unconfirmed, belief that the dragons escaped the tyranny and cultural genocide of the unicorns in the times before the Great Banishment. Attentive viewers might have noticed that while Grace picked up her Game Boy Color from the dragon in Episode 2, she apparently had her own original Game Boy already. Where does she keep the pair of them? Not the same place she keeps her blackcurrant juice bottle. She does have pockets, after all. Where does she keep her blackcurrant juice bottle? Don't ask. It started with them forcibly removing left-handers, or sinistrals as they had come to call them, from their homes and relocating them to places they called re-education establishments, insisting this was being done for their own safety and well-being. However, that's not where it ended. The re-education establishments of the modern Arvich Empire are in fact those very same facilities that were set up to process the left-handers back in those dark days. Bestian commentators have called out Arvich for this, saying their continued use of the things shows their hateful heart hasn't changed. Arvichine authorities have retaliated by saying it would be irrational not to make good use of the facilities now that they're there, and the complaints are just another example of bleeding boasting and cultural cringing nonsense from those self-righteous Bestians. Curiously, such protestations predominantly come from Libvativ or Southwing commentators in Bestia, being mysteriously all but absent from Concerebrals or the North Wing, who, when pressed for comment on this hot-button topic, refuse to take a stance, invariably saying something to the effect that the reappropriation of the re-education establishment facilities in both Arvich and Bestia is a complicated issue, and that the reliability of the official Bestian account of the sinister genocide is similarly complicated. Some have voiced concerns that such oddly wishy-washy, non-committal attitudes to the horrifying atrocities of the sinister genocide and their visible legacy might be symptoms of the North Wing's notorious and oft-demonstrated hostility to the left-handed. Such sentiments are categorically denied by the Concerebrals and their high-profile spokespeople and apologists, but many continue to strongly suspect that such denials are a thinly veiled front for what is actually a very unsavory disposition towards the left-handed that has been cemented in North Wing culture for its entire history, and that they're only concealing their true feelings because they're acutely aware of how unpopular such feelings are in the modern world. Some left-handers fear that they're merely biding their time, suspecting that the Concerebrals are secretly hopping society's newborn sympathies for the left-handed are just some kind of passing fad that will fade away at some point, whereupon they can reveal their true colors and start a renewed campaign of open aggression against the sinistrals. Tensions between children and adults appear to be reaching a fever pitch, with rising groups of young and old agitators alike emerging and clashing fiercely over various issues including education, work, sports, toys, politics, and proper compensation for chimney sweeping and lemonade stand operations. To get into more particular details on those last points, a growing groundswell of the world's children are vocally objecting to the disparity in working conditions between children and grown-ups. The standard going rate of popular child occupations including chimney sweep, coal miner, and lemonade stand operator is considered woefully inadequate by these children. The adult world snap back that being paid in candy bars was good enough for them when they were children, so it should be good enough for children now, the said sentiment being a common thread linking literally all adult backlashes against children's grievances. Children note that comparing the value of candies per hour, or CPH, paid to a child with the hourly wage paid to an adult doing the same work reveals that the child's wage in real terms is roughly 5% that of adults, while the quality of work done by the children appears by all measures to be more like 40% of that contributed by the average adult worker. The grown-up world is profoundly unsympathetic to this kind of political agitation from children, with common adult sentiments being they don't know they're born, we had to put up with it when we were their age and get off my lawn. The grown-ups have been moved to push their own identitarian grievances, arguing that they are expected to serve children hand on foot, working hard to provide all the things that children largely take for granted, while the children themselves spend most of their non-working, non-schooling time playing and generally goofing off, seeming offensively carefree and happy, whereas adults feel like they have the weight of the world on their shoulders in comparison. Children counter that adults' role in society is appropriate based on what they are capable to provide, whereas children are physically, emotionally, and psychologically ill-suited to consistently handle such burdens, and therefore they shouldn't have to. However, grown-ups see such arguments as excuses that children are hiding behind to cover their true motives, namely that they simply don't want to suffer these sorts of burdens themselves. Bestia adults also point to the minimum wage that was instituted recently as a sign that things are already moving in the direction children are pushing for, and that they should therefore stop the whining. However, children are quick to point out that this minimum wage only applies to humans over age 16, there is still no minimum for eons, although the libvatives insist they are working on it. Furthermore, the minimum is age-tiered, rising dramatically between the ages of 16 and 21, to the point that a 21-year-old will receive almost twice as much as a 16-year-old. The children argue that not only is this no consolation for working children between the ages of 3 and 15, but that the age tiering is absurd, with it seeming painfully obvious even to small children that there will be 16-year-olds who do far better work in their jobs than some 21-year-olds, and yet the minimum wage laws are utterly blind to this obvious point of common sense. Things like this lead many children to get the impression that the adult world is actually deeply unreasonable, prejudiced, hateful, presumptuous, callous, inhumane, and irrational, with much of its customs, conventions, rules, expectations, and overall nature being profoundly unfair, exploitative, abusive, and arbitrary, and that adults jealously cling to and defend it more out of a blind and mindless sense of inflexible loyalty to it than as a consequence of its inherent worthiness of such respect, in spite of the adult world's vehement and relentless insistence to the contrary. Children get the sense that in ignoring such problems, their elders are insidiously trying to trundle the younger generation through a deathly decrepit conveyor belt and into an utterly insufferable slavish nightmare world that no rational person would ever want to be a part of, let alone surrender themselves to of their own free will. Adults meanwhile feel sickened by what they see as children's rapidly deepening sense of what they call entitlement and snowflackery, with the collective adult world again falling back on their familiar position that since they had to put up with the conditions that modern children protest, the modern children should expect to suffer this themselves. But the recent demand from child agitators for maguls to institute a type of award they call participation trophies seems to have been the straw that broke the camel's back, as a new surge of adult campaigning and activism has now kicked off a full-blown culture war with their child rivals.